Stop.
The crack of skin against skin echoed through the ballroom, silencing the elite of New York in a single breathless second. Jorren Vailcrest, the Burgundy Lion, didn't even have time to blink before his whiskey was on the floor and his cheek was burning red. Standing before him wasn't an assassin or a rival boss, it was the maid who had been scrubbing his foyer that morning. To everyone in the room, Seren Valea had just committed suicide. But Seren didn't see the guns being drawn or the horrified face of Calderich in the background. She only saw the glint of the neurotoxin needle that had been inches from Jorren's neck, a needle held by the woman now screaming for Seren's head. Arieth. Seren had spent her life being wallpaper, a shadow working to pay for her father's failing lungs. She was a nobody in a lace cap. But tonight, the invisible girl just saved the devil's life, and the underworld will never be the same. The copper scent of bleach was the only perfume Seren Valea had known for 3 years. It clung to the pores of her deep brown skin, a sharp, clinical reminder of the boundary between her world and the one she polished to a mirror finish every day. At 5 in the morning, the Vailcrest estate was a tomb of silent marble and looming shadows, and Seren was the ghost tasked with haunting its floors. She knelt on the cold stone of the grand foyer, her joints aching with a familiarity that had become a second skin, pushing a scrub brush with a rhythmic, desperate force. To anyone who might pass by, she was a static fixture of the house, as unremarkable as the wainscoting or the heavy velvet drapes. This was the weight of silence she carried. In the heights of the Vailcrest hierarchy, to be seen was to be a threat or a toy, to be invisible was to survive. Seren had mastered the art of the lowered gaze and the softened footfall. She kept her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it felt like a physical restraint, topped with a simple lace maid's headpiece that served as her crown of invisibility. That scrap of white lace was a signal to the elite. Ignore me, for I am only the help. But beneath that lace cap, behind eyes that never seemed to wander, a fierce, protective fire burned, fueled by the memory of a different sound than the splashing of soapy water. Every evening when she returned to the cramped, dim apartment in the outskirts of the city, she was met by the rattling, wet wheeze of her father's lungs. It was a sound that haunted her more than any Mafia threat, the sound of a man drowning on dry land. The terminal respiratory illness had stolen his strength, his career, and his breath, leaving Seren as the sole bridge between him and the expensive oxygen tanks that kept him among the living. Every cent she earned at the estate was a heartbeat bought for him. The specialized treatments, the private consultations, the sheer cost of breathing in a city that didn't care if the poor choked it was a mountain of debt that loomed over her like the burgundy-draped walls of Jorren Vailcrest's study. She worked for the man they called the Burgundy Lion, a figure of arrogant authority who walked through his own home as if the people within it were merely obstacles to be navigated. Jorren Vailcrest never looked at her face. He saw the apron, the tray, the lace cap, and nothing more. To him, Seren was a tool, a silent shadow that ensured his whiskey was always full and his environment was pristine. She had learned to use that invisibility as a weapon. While the Lion and his associates, like the youthful and reckless Calderich, discussed the shifting tides of the New York underworld, they did so with a careless freedom, assuming the woman dusting the bookshelves was as deaf as she was unimportant. Seren heard the names of rivals, the logistics of shipments, and the simmering tensions of a coup she wasn't supposed to understand. Her hypervigilance, born from the need to anticipate Jorren's every whim to keep her job, had evolved into a sharp, analytical instinct. She didn't just see the dust, she saw the sweat on a bodyguard's brow when he lied. She didn't just hear the orders, she heard the tremor in a business partner's voice. Tonight was the night of the masquerade, the event that had the entire house vibrating with a dangerous, electric energy. As Seren stood in front of the cracked mirror in the staff quarters, pinning that lace headpiece into place, she felt the fire in her chest flare. Her father had been particularly weak that morning, his skin a terrifying shade of gray, his hand trembling as he signed for her to be careful. The stakes had never been higher. If she made a single mistake tonight, if she was anything less than perfect, the Lion would discard her, and her father's oxygen would be cut off by the end of the week. She smoothed the white trim of her fitted black dress and adjusted her apron, her jaw setting in a line of iron. She looked at herself, really looked, and saw the fierce woman hiding behind the servant's mask. The world saw a maid. Jorren saw a shadow. But as the first of the guests began to arrive in their shimmering gowns and classic tuxedos, Seren knew she was the only one truly watching. She walked out into the hall, her footsteps silent, her head slightly bowed, ready to play the part of the invisible girl one last time. She was prepared to endure the social slights, the cold indifference, and the crushing weight of her silence, all for the man struggling to breathe in a small room miles away. What she wasn't prepared for was the glint of silver she would soon catch, in the light a glint that would force her to step out of the shadows and strike the very man who held her life in his hands. As the orchestra began to play, Seren moved through the crowd like a ghost among the living, her tray balanced with practiced ease, her eyes locked on the predators she served. The pressure cooker was beginning to hiss, and the weight of her silence was about to become a scream. The dawn light didn't gently wake the Vailcrest estate. It pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a cold, judgmental eye. Seren Valea was already on her knees in the grand foyer, her deep brown skin glowing faintly in the morning gloom as she scrubbed the marble. The scent of lemon oil and beeswax clung to her skin, a poor substitute for the fresh air she craved. Every repetitive motion of her cloth was a heartbeat for her father, whose terminal respiratory illness made every breath in their cramped Bronx apartment a battle. She could almost hear that rattling, wet cough over the silence of the mansion, a sound that drove her to work until her knuckles were raw, and her jaw was set in quiet defiance. Then the silence broke. The heavy thud of Italian leather boots on the oak stairs announced the arrival of the Burgundy Lion. Jorren Vailcrest didn't just walk into a room, he occupied the oxygen within it. He was draped in a tailored burgundy suit jacket over a black open-collar shirt, the deep red of the fabric matching the amber whiskey already swirled in his hand. His face, framed by slicked-back dark hair and a trimmed beard, was a mask of calculated arrogance. He didn't look at Seren as he passed. To Jorren, she was as inanimate as the bronze statues lining the hallway, a tool that ensured his world remained pristine, nothing more. He checked his luxury wristwatch, the movement fluid and dismissive, and barked a single word without turning his head. Coffee, the library. Tube doblio minutus. He didn't wait for an acknowledgement, he didn't need one. Seren lowered her head, her sharp, expressive eyes tracing the hem of his trousers as he walked away. The fierce soul inside her burned, a quiet fire kept behind a cage of lace and servitude. She knew his arrogance was his armor, but today, as she watched him sip whiskey before breakfast, the weight of his authority felt heavier, more suffocating. Before she could stand, the scent of expensive, cloying lilies announced the second half of the estate's power dynamic. Arieth appeared like a shimmering silver ghost at the top of the stairs. Her long blonde hair was a cascade of artificial gold, every strand lacquered into a false shimmering perfection that dared the wind to move it. She wore a silver evening gown that caught the morning light in a way that felt aggressive, her makeup already flawless, as if she were a statue meant for display rather than a woman. Arieth paused at the landing, her hands resting elegantly on the railing, her eyes scanning the foyer until they landed on Seren. While Jorren's disregard was cold, Arieth's was poisonous. She offered a smile that never reached her eyes, a socialite's practiced curve that was designed to charm the powerful and crush those she deemed beneath her. "The floor is still damp, girl," Arieth remarked, her voice like velvet wrapped around a blade. She stepped down, her shimmering gown rustling with a rhythmic, taunting precision. "Jorren hates the smell of cleaning chemicals in the morning. Try to be more discreet." Arieth reached the bottom and adjusted her jewelry, looking at Seren as if she were a smudge on a masterpiece. She didn't see the woman who was the only variable in the coming coupe. She saw only a fitted black maid dress and a white apron. To her, Seren was wallpaper. "Yes, Miss Arieth," Seren replied, her voice a steady, practiced monotone that masked the hypervigilance lurking beneath. "And Seren?" Arieth turned back, her silver dress glittering like a serpent's scales. "Make sure the gala preparations are moved to the ballroom by noon. Jorren is in a foul mood today. Don't give him a reason to notice you." Seren watched them go, the lion and the serpent. They moved through the estate with the ease of predators who owned the jungle, never realizing that the invisible girl in their midst was the only one truly watching the shadows. As she gathered her cleaning supplies, her jaw set in a line of courageous defiance. She would endure the slights, the cold orders, and the suffocating arrogance for the sake of her father's life. She would be the wallpaper they expected. But as the pressure cooker atmosphere of the house began to rise, Seren Valea knew that even a shadow has its limits, and the Burgundy Lion was about to learn that some ghosts have teeth. The afternoon sun bled through the high, arched windows of the Vailcrest estate, casting long, golden bars across the floor that Seren Valea was currently polishing. Her knees ached against the cold stone, a familiar thrum of pain that she ignored with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her life being invisible. Every rhythmic stroke of her cloth was fueled by a singular haunting sound, the dry, rattling wheeze of her father's lungs echoing in their cramped Bronx apartment. She wasn't just cleaning, she was counting seconds, converting every polished inch of marble into another hour of oxygen for the man who had raised her. As the house buzzed with the frantic energy of masquerade preparations, Seren moved toward the butler's pantry to stow her supplies. The air here was different, thick with the scents of expensive tannins, roasted meats, and the floral perfume that heralded the arrival of the elite. She was a shadow in the corner, her black uniform and white apron blending into the dark mahogany cabinetry as she moved with the silence of a ghost. The heavy swinging doors creaked open, and Seren instinctively pulled back into the narrow recess between the china cabinets. Arieth stepped in, her shimmering silver gown rustling like a field of frozen grass. Following her was Calderic, his youthful face stripped of its usual party guest grin, replaced by a look of sharp, predatory intent. To them, the pantry was empty. To them, Seren was merely part of the furniture, a piece of the house that lacked ears or a soul. "He's becoming a nuisance, Calderic," Arieth hissed, her voice a jagged contrast to her glamorous appearance. She reached up, adjusting a diamond earring with fingers that didn't tremble. "Jorren's ego is outgrowing his usefulness. The Burgundy Lion thinks he's invincible, but even lions sleep." Calderic leaned against a silver service table, his tuxedo jacket pulling tight across his shoulders. "The transition has to be seamless. If the family suspects a coup, we won't last an hour. It has to look like a tragedy, not a hit." "It will," Arieth replied, her blue eyes turning icy. She held up her hand, and Seren caught the lethal glint of a tiny, microfine needle concealed within the intricate setting of a silver ring. A painless end for a painful man, one touch during the toast, a neurotoxin that mimics a heart attack, and the Vailcrest Empire belongs to us. He'll be dead before he hits the marble. Seren's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Her hypervigilance, the very trait that allowed her to navigate the dangerous moods of the estate, now made every word feel like a physical blow. She watched as Arieth leaned into Calderic, their faces close in a mockery of a lover's embrace, discussing the total erasure of the man who currently paid for the very silk they wore. "And the help?" Calderic asked, glancing toward the door. "The witnesses?" "Disposable," Arieth shrugged, her tone dripping with the contempt Seren had felt every day of her employment. "They're nobodies. If we need a scapegoat, we'll pick a maid. No one listens to shadows." The duo exited as quickly as they had arrived, leaving the pantry in a suffocating silence. Seren remained tucked away, her hands gripping her apron so tightly her knuckles turned white. The internal struggle was a fever in her blood. If she stayed silent, she could finish her shift, take her pay, and buy her father another week of life. If she spoke, she was a housemaid accusing a socialite, nobody trying to topple a queen. She walked to a polished silver platter on the counter and caught her reflection. The lace-made headpiece sat neatly atop her bun, framing a face that was supposed to be submissive, but beneath the deep brown of her skin, her eyes were fierce-locked on the woman in the reflection who refused to let a murder happen on her watch. She knew the stakes. If she failed, Jorren would die, and she would likely be the one disappeared to cover the tracks. The masquerade was no longer just a party, it was a trap. Seren smoothed her apron, her jaw setting with a courage that had been forged in the fires of poverty and desperation. She was a shadow, yes, but tonight she would be the only shadow that saw the snake in the grass. The masquerade gala at the Vailcrest estate was a symphony of gold and shadow, a world away from the oxygen-starved room where Seren's father fought for every breath. As Seren stood near the heavy velvet drapes, her tray of crystal flutes balanced with practiced precision, she felt the weight of her lace headpiece like a crown of thorns. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of imported lilies and the kind of expensive cologne that cost more than a year of her father's respiratory treatments. Everywhere she looked, the elite moved with a predatory grace, their faces half hidden by ornate masks of silk and obsidian. To them, Seren was just a flicker of black and white in their peripheral vision, a shadow whose only purpose was to ensure their glasses never ran dry. She adjusted her white apron, her fingers brushing against the pocket where she kept a small, frayed picture of her father. Every laugh that echoed through the hall, every clink of silver against fine china, felt like a personal insult to the struggle happening in the Bronx. She watched a guest spill a drop of vintage wine that cost 3 months of oxygen, and her jaw tightened, her deep brown skin glowing under the harsh light of the chandeliers. But she kept her eyes down, her face a mask of subservient calm, even as the fierce soul beneath her uniform burned with a silent, righteous anger. She was wallpaper, she was invisible, she was the only one in the room actually paying attention. Jorren Vailcrest stood at the center of the orbit, a Burgundy Lion in his perfectly tailored designer suit. He held a glass of whiskey with an arrogance that suggested the very floor beneath him existed only by his permission. Beside him, Arieth was a vision of shimmering silver, her blonde hair styled into flawless waves that caught the light with every practiced tilt of her head. To the crowd, they were the ultimate power couple, the king and queen of the New York underworld. But Seren, standing just a few feet away with her tray, saw the truth in the small, jagged movements of Arieth's hands. She saw the way Arieth's eyes flickered toward Kaldaric, who stood near the bar in a classic tuxedo, his youthful face twisted into a look of nervous anticipation. Seren remembered the whispers she had overheard in the pantry, the cold, calculated discussion of a painless end and a stolen inheritance. The memory made her blood run cold. She watched as Arieth leaned into Jorren's side, the silver sequins of her gown brushing against his burgundy sleeve. It looked like an act of affection, but Seren noticed the way Arieth's fingers toyed with a heavy ornate ring on her right hand. There was a glint there, not the sparkle of a diamond, but the cold, clinical shine of a microneedle. The music slowed, a low, haunting melody that signaled the evening's traditional toast. Jorren raised his glass, his dark hair slicked back, and his trimmed beard framed by a smile that didn't reach his sharp, commanding eyes. "To the future of the Vailcrest legacy," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The guests raised their flutes in unison, a forest of crystal shimmering under the stars. Seren felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw Arieth adjust her grip, her thumb pressing against a hidden catch on her ring. The microneedle, laced with the neurotoxin Seren knew was meant to end the Vailcrest line, emerged like a serpent's fang. Arieth began to lean in, her red lips parted as if for a celebratory kiss on Jorren's cheek, a kiss that would deliver a lethal dose directly into his jugular. Kaldaric watched from the shadows, his mouth slightly open, his hand gripping his drink so tightly his knuckles were white. He was waiting for the fall. He was waiting for the Burgundy Lion to collapse, so he and the serpent in silk could seize the throne. Seren looked at the security guards lining the walls. They were focused on the doors, searching for guns and rival hitmen, completely oblivious to the threat sitting right at the boss's heart. Seren realized that in 3 seconds, Jorren Vailcrest would be a dead man. If she stayed silent, she would keep her job. She would take her wages home, buy the oxygen, and survive another week in the shadows. But if she let him die, she would be the silent accomplice to a murder. She thought of her father, a man of honor even in his sickness, and the fierce soul she had inherited from him finally broke through the layers of subservience. She dropped her tray, the sound of shattering crystal cutting through the toast like a lightning strike. As every head in the room turned toward the clumsy Maid, Seren didn't look at the floor. She didn't bow her head in apology. She lunged forward, her black and white uniform a blur of motion against the silver and burgundy. She saw Arieth's hand moving, the needle inches from Jorren's neck. Seren didn't think about the consequences or the guns that would inevitably be drawn. She only saw the target. With a strength born of a lifetime of labor and a decade of suppressed rage, Seren swung her arm. Her palm connected with Jorren's cheek with a crack that silenced the ballroom. The whiskey flew from his hand, the burgundy jacket stained as he was jarred violently away from Arieth's lethal reach. The invisible girl had just committed the ultimate sin, and as she stood there, chest heaving and eyes locked onto the stunned Mafia boss, she knew the world she lived in was about to burn. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of $1.00 per ounce perfume and the suffocating arrogance of the New York elite. Above, the crystal chandeliers scattered light like imprisoned stars, but to Seren Valea, they were just thousands of surfaces she had spent the previous night polishing until her fingers bled. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, her fitted black Maid dress and white apron marking her as a ghost in a room full of gods. Her lace headpiece felt like a crown of thorns, a constant reminder that in this world of burgundy silk and silver gowns, she was meant to be seen but never heard. Jorren Vailcrest, the Burgundy Lion, stood at the center of the gilded circle, a glass of vintage whiskey gripped in a hand that held the power of life and death. He looked every bit the king his name suggested, his burgundy designer jacket, a splash of royal blood against the black tie crowd. Beside him, Arieth was a shimmering vision in silver, her long blonde hair cascading over her shoulders as she leaned into his space with practiced serpentine grace. To the casual observer, they were the underworld's most beautiful couple. To Seren, they were a predator and a victim who didn't yet know he was being hunted. Seren's hypervigilance, a trait honed by years of surviving the razor-edged moods of the wealthy, caught the movement before Jorren's own elite security did. As Arieth leaned in, her hand moved with the fluid precision of a striking cobra. Between her manicured fingers glinted a microneedle, a sliver of death laced with a neurotoxin that would stop a man's heart before he could even cry out. In that heartbeat, Seren's world narrowed. She thought of her father, of the rhythmic, agonizing rattle of his lungs in their cramped apartment, and the mountain of debt that kept her tethered to the Vailcrest floorboards. If she stayed silent, she stayed safe. If she let the needle find its mark, the man who treated her like furniture would be gone. But Seren Valea was not a coward, and her soul was too fierce to allow murder to happen on her watch, even for a man who didn't know her name. She didn't think she lunged. The crack of her palm against Jorren's cheek was louder than the orchestra, a sharp, violent sound that shattered the masquerade's carefully curated silence. The force of the blow sent Jorren's head snapping to the side, his whiskey flying from his glass to stain his burgundy lapel like a fresh wound. For a second, the universe seemed to stop. Kaldaric stood frozen in the background, his mouth wide in a silent gasp, while the blonde socialite Arieth recoiled with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Assassin!" Arieth's voice tore through the silence, shrill and accusing. "The maid tried to kill him. Get here." Seren didn't pull her hand back. She stood her ground, her deep brown skin glowing under the harsh lights, her sharp, expressive eyes locked onto Jorren's stunned, squeezing shut gaze. She ignored the heavy thud of security boots rushing toward her and the cold click of weapons being drawn. She only saw the tiny silver needle that had fallen from Arieth's hand, now lost among the shards of Jorren's broken whiskey glass. "Look at the glass," Seren commanded, her voice low and steady, a sharp contrast to the chaos erupting around her. Jorren opened his eyes, the shock of the physical defiance stripping away his arrogant authority. He looked at the girl in the lace headpiece, seeing her for the first time in 3 years of service. He saw the set of her jaw and the lack of fear in her eyes. Before he could speak, 2 guards slammed Seren into the marble floor. Her face was pressed against the cold stone she had scrubbed only hours before, her arms wrenched behind her back. The invisible girl was gone, replaced by a target. But as they dragged her toward the darkness of the cellar, Seren didn't bow her head. She had broken the social hierarchy to save a lion, and as she met Jorren's gaze one last time, she knew the world they inhabited had just been set on fire. The wine cellar was a tomb of damp stone and expensive dust, smelling of old cork and the iron tang of Seren's own blood. The transition from the glittering golden warmth of the ballroom to this freezing darkness had been violent. Her lace headpiece was gone, ripped away when the security team had slammed her into the concrete, and her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches that hurt her ribs. But as the heavy oak door creaked open, Seren didn't curl into herself. She sat on the lone wooden chair at the center of the room, her wrists bound with zip ties that bit into her deep brown skin, and she forced her chin up. Jorren Vailcrest didn't storm in. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. He was still wearing the burgundy suit, though the jacket was open and his black shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. The red mark of Seren's palm was a vivid, angry brand against his light skin. In his hand he carried a fresh glass of whiskey, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that felt like a countdown. He stopped inches from her, his shadow swallowing her whole. For a long minute he just looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. The silence was a physical weight, pressing against Seren's chest until she felt the phantom wheeze of her father's lungs in her own throat. She knew what he saw, a disposable girl in a ruined apron, a maid who had forgotten her place. "Who paid you, Seren?" His voice was a low, dangerous purr, devoid of the shock from the ballroom. Now, there was only the cold calculation of the Burgundy Lion. Was it Calderic? Did he promise you enough to buy your father a new set of lungs if you humiliated me in front of the 5 families? "No one paid me," Seren replied, her voice hoarse but steady. She didn't look at his shoes, she looked directly into his eyes, breaking the final rule of the Vailcrest house. "I saved your life, Jorren. If I wanted to humiliate you, I would have let you die on that floor while Arieth smiled over your corpse." Jorren's jaw tightened, the muscle leaping under his skin. He leaned down, his face so close she could smell the peat of the whiskey. "Watch your tongue. You struck me. You caused a riot in my home. And now you expect me to believe that my companion, the woman I have protected for 3 years, is a murderer. Arrogance is a blindfold, and you're wearing it tight." Seren snapped, her fierce soul rising to the surface. "You see me every day, but you never actually see me. You think I'm just part of the furniture, so you don't notice when I'm watching. I saw them in the pantry, Jorren. I saw Arieth and Calderic. They weren't whispering about love. They were whispering about how long it takes for a neurotoxin to stop a man's heart." Jorren let out a short, mocking laugh, but his eyes stayed cold. "A ghost story from a maid who wants to play hero. Why should I believe you over her?" "Because if I were an assassin, you'd be dead," Seren said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the damp air. "I saw the needle, a micro-needle, hidden between her fingers when she leaned in for that kiss. She wasn't going to embrace you, she was going to end you. And if you think I'm lying, don't take my word for it. Go back upstairs. Look at the silver filigree ring on her left hand, the one with the emerald that matches her eyes." Jorren froze. The clinking of the ice stopped. "The emerald is a hinge," Seren continued, her hyper-vigilance serving her one last time. "She touched it 3 times before she approached you. It's a pressurized delivery system. If you find that needle empty, then I'm a fool. But if you find it full, you owe me more than just an apology." Jorren studied her, searching for a flicker of a lie in her expressive eyes. He saw only the defiance of a woman who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. He stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the stone like a scream. He didn't say a word as he turned and walked toward the door. "Jorren," she called out before the heavy oak could swing shut. He paused, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. "My father is at 422 West Oak. If you kill me here, make sure someone checks his oxygen. He doesn't have much time." The door slammed shut, the bolt sliding home with a finality that left Seren in total darkness. She slumped back against the chair, the adrenaline fading into a cold, hollow terror. She had gambled her life on a silver ring and the observation skills of a woman who was paid to be invisible. Now, all she could do was wait to see if the Burgundy Lion would hunt the serpent in his bed, or if he would return to finish what the shadows started. The air in the wine cellar was thick with the scent of damp stone and expensive oak, a cold contrast to the burning heat still radiating from Jorren's cheek. He stood over Seren, his burgundy jacket discarded on a crate, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He studied the woman in the chair, the maid who had dared to strike the king of the city. Her lace headpiece was crooked, and her dark skin was smudged with the dust of the basement, but her eyes were like twin beacons of defiance. They didn't flicker with the frantic fear of a liar, they held the steady, searing heat of a witness to a crime. "If you are lying, Seren Valea," Jorren whispered, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to vibrate the very bottles on the shelves, "I will ensure you are forgotten before the sun rises. But if there is even a shadow of a needle in that ring—" He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. He turned on his heel, signaling the guards to stay, and stormed out of the cellar. Each footfall against the stone was a heartbeat of growing realization. He remembered the way Arieth had leaned in, her perfume sweet and cloying, her hands wandering toward the nape of his neck. He had thought it was desire. Now, the thought made his skin crawl. The ballroom above was a hive of hushed whispers and frantic energy. Guests like Calderic stood in tight circles, their eyes darting toward the stairs, waiting for the verdict of blood. In the center of the chaos sat Arieth. She was a vision in shimmering silver, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a silk handkerchief pressed to her eyes as she wept for the cameras. She looked like a grieving widow-to-be, the perfect picture of devastated loyalty. When Jorren entered, the room went silent. He didn't look at the guests. He didn't look at Calderic, who took a nervous step back. He walked straight to Arieth. She rose, a sob escaping her throat as she reached for him. "Jorren, darling, tell me they've dealt with that creature. Tell me you're safe." He caught her hands. His grip wasn't a caress, it was a vice. Arieth's eyes widened, the tears drying instantly as she felt the cold steel of his gaze. "Your ring, Arieth," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "It's a beautiful piece. Let me see it." A flicker of pure, crystalline terror flashed across her face, a second of honesty that confirmed everything Seren had screamed in the ballroom. Arieth tried to pull back, her shimmering gown rustling like a snake in the grass. It's a family heirloom, Jorren. You're hurting me." "The truth hurts more," he growled. He didn't wait for her permission. He twisted the silver band, his thumb finding the microscopic catch Seren had described. With a sharp click, a needle no thicker than a hair slid from the setting, its tip glistening with a faint, oily residue. The silence that followed was deafening. Calderic turned deathly pale, his hand trembling against his tuxedo, while the guests drew back as if Arieth herself had turned into a viper. Jorren stared at the needle, the weapon that had been seconds away from ending his life. The sting of Seren's slap was nothing compared to the agonizing weight of this betrayal. He had given Arieth a throne at his side. He had trusted her with his secrets, his empire, and his bed. And all the while she had been counting the seconds until his heart stopped. "You," Jorren said, his voice cracking with a rage so profound it was quiet. "You were the one I called queen, and you were nothing but a parasite waiting for the host to die." Arieth didn't plead. The mask of the socialite shattered, revealing the cold, calculating strategist beneath. She looked at him with a sneer of pure venom. "You were always a fool, Jorren. You thought you were untouchable. You thought a man like you deserved a woman like me. I was just the one brave enough to try and take what you didn't earn." Jorren didn't strike her. He didn't need to. He signaled to his security, and the serpent in silk was dragged from the hall, her silver heels scraping against the marble she had tried to steal. He turned his gaze to Calderic, whose knees finally gave way. The Burgundy Lion didn't even waste a word on the man. A single nod to his enforcers was enough to seal the traitor's fate. But as the room cleared and the lights of the gala seemed to dim, Jorren felt a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of revenge could fill. He had been surrounded by thousands, yet he had been utterly alone. The only person in his entire world who had dared to tell him the truth, who had risked her life to shatter the illusion, was the woman he had treated like a shadow. He returned to the cellar, his steps slower this time. The guards moved aside as he entered. Seren was still there, her head bowed, her hands cuffed to the iron chair. She looked up as the door groaned open, her eyes searching his face for the verdict. Jorren didn't speak. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the key, and knelt before her. The most powerful man in the city was on his knees at the feet of a housemaid. He unlocked the cuffs, the metal clattering to the floor. He took her hands, the hands that had worked his foyers and saved his life, and found they were trembling. "She's gone," he whispered. "The needle, the lies, all of it." Seren let out a breath that sounded like a sob. her fierce soul finally allowing itself to flicker. "I just wanted you to live," she whispered. "I didn't care what happened to me. I just couldn't let it happen." Jorren looked at the red mark on his own cheek, then back at the woman who had put it there. The betrayal of Arieth had left a wound, but the honesty of Seren was the only thing that could heal it. He didn't see a maid anymore. He saw the only person who had ever truly seen him. "You saved me, Seren," he said, his voice thick with a new kind of authority, one born of respect rather than fear. "And now, I am going to make sure the world finally sees you." The morning air at the Vailcrest estate no longer smelled of the caustic bleach Seren had used to scrub the floors for years. Instead, a heavy, expectant silence hung over the halls, a stillness that followed a storm. The Burgundy Lion had finished his hunt. In the grand study, Jorren Vailcrest sat behind his obsidian desk, the bruise on his cheek a gift from Seren's palm, now a faint, darkening mark of her loyalty. Across from him, Arieth stood stripped of her shimmering silver gown and her pride, dressed in a simple traveling suit that signaled her fall from grace. Jorren didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. He simply slid a digital tablet across the desk, the screen glowing with encrypted transcripts and the forensic analysis of the silver ring that had nearly been his undoing. Arieth's face, once the pinnacle of socialite perfection, crumbled into a mask of pathetic desperation. She reached for his hand, her lips trembling with a plea, but Jorren withdrew as if her touch were the neurotoxin itself. With a single sharp nod to his security detail, the decree was final. Arieth was not merely leaving the house, she was being erased from the city. Her accounts were frozen, her family ties severed by a single phone call from Jorren to the Chicago syndicates. As she was led out, she cast one final venomous glance at Seren, who stood by the door, no longer cowering but watching the serpent be removed from the garden. 2 hours later, the world changed for Seren in a way that felt more like a dream than a Tuesday afternoon. She stood in the lobby of the St. Jude Private Clinic, a facility where the air was filtered to a purity she hadn't known existed. The rattling, wet wheeze that had defined her father's existence for 3 years was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of a state-of-the-art ventilator. She watched through a glass partition as a team of world-class specialists adjusted her father's monitors. He was sleeping, his chest rising and falling with an ease that brought tears to Seren's eyes. "The damage is extensive, but reversible with the right treatment," a doctor murmured beside her. "Mr. Vailcrest has authorized a full transplant and long-term rehabilitation. You don't need to worry about the cost, Miss Valea. It's already been handled." Seren leaned her forehead against the cool glass, her hand trembling. The mountain of debt that had threatened to bury her family had been leveled by a man she had once feared. She realized then that the invisible life she had led was over. The lace headpiece she had discarded in the cellar was a relic of a girl who had disappeared the moment she struck a king to save his crown. When she returned to the estate that evening, she was summoned not to the kitchen, but to the top-floor office. Jorren was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the flickering lights of Manhattan. He didn't turn when she entered, but she felt his presence, the weight of his authority, now tempered by a strange, newfound respect. "The maid's quarters have been cleared," Jorren said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "Your things have been moved to a suite on the residential floor. It's closer to the office." Seren stepped forward, her jaw set. "I told you in the cellar, Jorren. I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because it was right." He turned then, his gray eyes searching hers. The arrogance was still there, but beneath it was the weariness of a man who had realized his entire world was built on lies. "I know why you did it. That's exactly why I can't have you scrubbing floors anymore, Seren. You have something my advisors lack. You have eyes that see the glint of a needle when everyone else is looking at the silk. You have a soul that can't be bought." He walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. "I'm creating a new position, director of the Vailcrest Foundation. You'll oversee the scholarships, the clinics, the real work we do behind the shadows. I need someone who knows what it's like to be invisible to find the people we're supposed to be protecting." Seren looked at him, her fierce soul rising to the surface. She wasn't the help anymore. She was the woman who had seen the devil and refused to blink. "I don't want a handout, Jorren. I want to earn it. A rare, genuine smile tugged at the corner of Jorren's mouth. "You already earned it the moment you broke my jaw. The salary is 200,000,000 a year, and your father's care is a permanent line item on my ledger. Not as a gift, but as a retainer for the only person in this city I can actually trust." Seren looked out at the city, the same city that had tried to crush her only a week ago. The new order had begun. She wasn't a ghost in the halls anymore. She was the one who would decide who got to walk through them. The scent of caustic bleach and the ache in my knees were ghosts of a different life, lingering only in the back of my mind as I stepped out of the black sedan. A year ago, I arrived at the Vailcrest estate through the service entrance, my head bowed and my fingers red from scrubbing the cold marble I was now walking across in custom-made silk. The night air was thick with the fragrance of blooming jasmine and the salt of the nearby coast. But the real electricity was inside the ballroom, the same room where I had once been wallpaper. I didn't reach for a lace maid's cap tonight. Instead, my hair was woven into an intricate crown of braids, pinned with small, shimmering emeralds that caught the light of the massive crystal chandeliers. My gown was a deep, iridescent silk that moved like liquid moonlight, a far cry from the black and white uniform that had once been my skin. As I entered, the orchestra didn't miss a beat, but the room did. The same socialites who once looked through me as if I were made of glass now found their conversations dying in their throats. I saw them, the ones who had laughed while I cleared their discarded napkins, now adjusting their pearls with trembling fingers. I didn't seek their approval. I had already taken their attention. Jorren was waiting for me at the center of the hall. He still wore burgundy. It was his color, the mark of the Burgundy Lion, but the arrogance that used to sharpen his features had been replaced by something far more dangerous: devotion. He wasn't holding a whiskey glass this time. He was holding his hand out for me. "You're late," he murmured as I reached him, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the silk of my dress. A faint silver scar still marked the place on his jaw where my hand had connected with his skin a year ago, a permanent reminder of the night I chose his life over my own safety. "A queen arrives exactly when she intends to, Jorren. A maid is the only one who has to be on time," I replied, a slow smile tugging at my lips. He let out a short, dry laugh, the kind of sound he only made when it was just the two of us. He tucked my arm into his, leaning down so his breath brushed my ear. "The board of the Vailcrest Foundation is waiting to hear your opening remarks. They're terrified of you, you know. They've heard you have a very impactful way of making a point." "Good," I said, my voice steady and fierce. "They should be." We moved through the crowd as partners, a unified force that the underworld had finally learned to respect. I thought of my father, resting in a private wing with the best respiratory specialists money could buy, his breathing no longer a rattling struggle but a quiet, rhythmic peace. I thought of the specialized equipment that had saved him, funded by the very man who now walked beside me as an equal. As we passed the spot where Arieth had once stood with her poisoned needle, I didn't feel a flicker of fear. The serpent in silk was gone, a casualty of her own treachery, and Kaldaric had followed her into the shadows of exile. They had underestimated the Maid because they couldn't conceive of a soul that wasn't for sale. They hadn't realized that while I was scrubbing their floors, I was learning the foundations of their empire, and how easily they could be toppled by someone who knew where the dirt was hidden. Jorren led me to the stage, the same one where he used to stand alone. He stepped back, giving me the floor. His eyes locked on mine with a pride that was louder than any applause. I looked out at the sea of diamonds and designer suits, the invisible girl finally standing in the light. "1 year ago, I was told that my only job was to be silent," I began, my voice carrying to every corner of the room without the need for a microphone. "Tonight, I am here to tell you that silence is over." I felt Jorren's hand settle briefly on the small of my back, a grounding, silent promise. The power shift wasn't just in the titles we held or the money in the bank. It was in the way I looked at the world. I no longer had to bow my head to survive. I had punched, slapped, and clawed my way into a life where the only person I answered to was the woman I saw in the mirror. The Burgundy Lion had found his mate, and the girl from the shadows had finally claimed the sun. Sometimes, the loudest truth is found in a single, silent action. Seren Valea proved that being invisible doesn't mean you are powerless. Did that slap echo in your heart too? If you live for the moment the underdog turns into the queen, don't let the story end here. Hit that subscribe button to join the family at Whisper Mafia Shadow. We bring you the most intense tales of mafia romance and redemption every single day. Like and share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that their courage is their greatest weapon. Sound off in the comments. What would you do if you saw a traitor leaning in for a kiss? Would you risk it all to strike first, or would you stay in the shadows?